start. There are probably a couple stragglers in the hallway. I'm Jeff Lindemer. I'm a member of Lamoille County Chamber, and I'm up here to welcome our guests and introduce Mike Hartman, CEO. Thanks to Lamoille County Mental Health. Mike is the CEO of Lamoille County Mental Health, and he'd like to say a couple words.
As Jeff said, I just wanted to welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us this morning. And eat heartily, please. We have plenty of food here, so feel free to take something with you if you still have any pangs on the way out the door. There's lots of finger food as well as full breakfast. And I want to ask you all to feel free to ask anybody here any questions while you're here. We are glad to host and be part of the Chamber round meeting with legislators, and we certainly appreciate the work that the legislative crew for Lamoille County and surrounding areas do. And I don't want to take up any time because I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to engage. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, we have everybody, all our legislators are here except Dave. I haven't heard he's not coming, so he may still show up. And I really want to welcome our legislators because they put in a huge amount of effort. They've got a lot going on, and this is our opportunity to communicate with them. So I'm not going to speak other than to move on to the next person. Some of our legislators have to leave here at 9, so remember to keep things brief, and we'll move right along. Hey, Heidi, would you like to start?
No.
I guess what we're going to do is update from last meeting.
Sure.
And open it up, well, we'll open it up afterwards for questions.
So Heidi Scheuermann, I represent Stowe. Just a couple of updates from the last one. I've been focused a lot in my time over there on tourism this year. I think it's going well. We've got a really good coalition of folks together, broad bipartisan support, and we'll know soon if we're able to succeed in getting that additional funding into the appropriations bill. That the governor recommended $1 million in one-time funding, additional for marketing, $500,000 for tourism and marketing, $250 for outdoor rec, which is like state parks, hunting and fishing, and then $250 for economic development. We're really focused on the tourism, but anyway, so that's good. I'm on the Energy and Technology Committee, and we did the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's 3 of us here, so I'm sure others will talk about it. I was hopeful that I'd be able to support it and worked hard to make it into something I could. In general, I support it. All the the ideas in it, the Climate Council, some other things, but just could not support the relinquishing of our legislative responsibility to the Secretary of A&R, which is what we do in large part. We give that broad authority, sort of like the legislature's version of the Staples easy button. That was easy, so we've done it, and yet the rulemaking, the efforts through which the climate plan will go into effect will be done via rules in most cases. Taxes and fees won't be done via rule, but in most cases, it could be done by rule, and so I'm hopeful that I can work to make it something better, that the legislature will have a say in what those policies might be that will implement the climate plan, and I understand that from what I hear, the Senate has real concerns about that as well. So we'll see. So.
Good morning, I'm Dan Noyes. I'm on the Human Services Committee, and this last week we worked on our budget letter. We're a committee of jurisdiction for Department of Health, Department of Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living, and also Department of Children and Families. So we look at the governor's proposed budget and make recommendations. I had the Department of Health with Representative Paella from Londonderry. And we just went through and looked at a couple of things. We support the governor's increase in a program that works with young mothers. So put that in there. We also were interested in some EMS funding that allows more training, and we added some language around the recovery centers, so making sure that they were adequately funded. And so we sent that letter over on Friday. Otherwise, in committee, we have been working on the Older Vermonters Act, which is a bill that I am sponsoring with Teresa Wood from Waterbury. And what that does is basically bring together all the agencies that provide services to older Vermonters, and Meals on Wheels and all the senior centers and state agencies, and tries to come up with a plan on how we're going to be able to provide services effectively, and what the measurements are for, 1 in 4 are going to be over 65 in 10 years. So we're trying to figure out what that looks like and plan. That bill will be taking testimony and hopefully voting out of committee this week. There's a couple things in it that we're trying to move forward, and that would be a inflationary increase for home and community-based providers that right now have been level funded for a while. So we're trying to keep that in there, but we're not sure. We want to see this bill move. We're also looking at some changes in the reporting that the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living does, and making sure that it covers a lot more than what they've been doing, so that we have a better idea of where the programs are. One last thing I'll talk about is the Office of the Child Advocate, which is a bill that I put in with Ann Pugh. That bill is going to come out as a committee to really look at how this Office of the Child Advocate would be integrated into state government, because there's so many questions that we really couldn't take the time in committee to dig down on, like, would it be housed in the Office of Administration? Would it be at legal aid? And so what we're going to do is put together a group of stakeholders over the summer, just like we did with the Older Vermonters Act, and then come back with some draft legislation next year that's a little more definitive and kind of lays out what this should look like. Basically, just quickly, the Office of the Child Advocate would be some agency outside of state government that could really look at what's happening at DCF and with children that are in state custody, with the goal of helping them transition to adulthood. So right now, there's the oversight is not as robust as we'd like to see, and there's a lot of confidentiality that has to be worked out, and the Office of the Child Advocate would be like an ombudsman program, just like we have for nursing homes. So it would be able to keep that confidentiality and also look at what is going on and maybe come up with some really good solutions. So I'll leave it at that right now. Avram?
Good morning. I'm Avram Patt. I represent the Lamoille, Washington district, which is Morrisville, otherwise known as Morristown, Elmore, and in Washington County, Worcester and Woodbury. I live in Worcester. And I am also on the Energy and Technology Committee, and as you probably know, the House did pass by quite a large margin the Global Warming Solutions Act, which did come out of our committee on a 7-2 vote. I voted in favor. I do believe, actually, that in terms of the legislature's role in this, that the legislature, as the bill is written, actually has somewhat more of a role in the rulemaking process than is the case in most rulemaking. State agencies are given authority to make rules and implement them in energy and human services and transportation and pretty much everything that state government does. And they have, in this case, we put in an additional step of legislative review. I do have a couple of handouts, and I'd be happy to talk with people individually afterwards if you have questions. A couple of frequently asked questions about this bill. The other area where I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding is on what's called the cause of action, which allows citizens to bring legal action against the state if the state is not implementing and meeting the carbon reduction goals as stated in the bill. What the bill does, any citizen can bring a suit against state government now. Anyone about anything, whether it has merit or not, and they can ask for damages. What this does is actually significantly limit the type of suit that can only be brought if the state is not doing the measurable things that are in the bill, and it also specifically does not allow damages. So it actually narrows the scope of legal action compared to what might happen otherwise. So I'm hoping, I know the Senate will take this up now that it's passed out of the House. I don't know what changes will be. I'm sure there will be changes of one kind or another, and that this will end up being hopefully resolved in the conference committee. I did want to mention one other thing unrelated to our committee work, which is the House Appropriation Committee, in working on the budget, had asked, in addition to asking committees for comment on appropriations matters related to our subject areas, they also asked us each as individuals if we had something we wanted to tell the committee about a particular thing as an individual, to come in, to schedule a time and come in. And I came in last week after not thinking I was going to have anything to talk about, and then reading the newspaper and discovering that the governor's budget proposes to eliminate entirely funding for the statewide micro-business development program, which is run by the community action agencies, capstone in this area. And the reason why that struck me was I had some very personal and direct involvement with that program when I was the state OEO director in the 1990s, which was an appointed position. I served under 3 governors during that time, and was involved in a decision to move the administration of the loan program out of state government, which was not a good fit. It had been one person in our office running it, at first to VITA and then to the community action agencies, which were already doing all of the outreach and assistance to lower income people, lower and moderate income people starting small businesses. And I had a bit of the history. The Job Start program, it was originally called Job Start, was started by Governor Snelling. And it was had been operating at OEO when I got there. Along with Secretary Con Hogan at the time, recommended that we should not be running a loan program out of our little office. It moved to VITA, where it was too small compared to what VITA usually does in terms of the size of loans. And so it ended up being housed in the CAP agencies, which I think is the right place. So in this newspaper article, quoted both Sue Mintner, the executive director of Capstone, as well as Tom Donahue, the executive director of Bennington Rutland Opportunity Council, who I worked with on various things. And I told the story, not the other people can best talk about exactly what the program does today and how it spends its money. I just gave a bit of the history. I think that had a positive effect on the committee members. And I'm hoping that this relatively small program, I think the state spending is about $300,000, so it's not a huge thing in the scheme of things. So that was a little sort of blast from my past that I worked on last week.
So I'm Matt Hill. Dan and I share a district, Lamoille 2. Apologize I didn't make it last week. I came down with for the second time the legislative flu, which the state house flu, as you call it. Still not 100%, but it's like a petri dish in that place, so you preschool or something. Anyway, so this year I moved from Commerce and Economic Development to the Natural Resources Committee. For a couple reasons. I think they wanted, the leadership in the House wanted somebody who was able to kind of navigate a sticky situation with Act 250 reform, and they were a little nervous. A seat was vacated last year by Bob Forgay, who passed away unexpectedly during the session. So they were a little nervous about having a freshman go on a committee that had a pretty big bill in front of them. So I was asked to move over, which I reluctantly said yes. It's kind of hard to say no to the speaker, I suppose, sometimes. And so we did that, and we've been working through Act 250. We actually just passed it out. I was able to chat with a few people in this room actually about Act 250 reform, and it was very helpful in my thought process. We've also had a couple other things come by our plate. We had a little piece of the cannabis bill, which is now apparently on the House floor. I just learned this morning, so that's good. Let's see. We also have some wildlife bills too. We have a migratory bird bill and a couple other things. This year was really a curveball for me. I had a lot of things I was looking forward to do around workforce development. I'm on the state workforce development board, and it's kind of been my life for the past 7 or 8 years, going back to my time at the Department of Labor. So, my priority is still there. I know the Commerce and Economic Development Committee is still plugging away on workforce development initiatives. I think there's a big push to get the trades boosted up, and as far as tech centers go, and training and that sort. And the governor has backed that up too. That's very good, and it would serve this area very well. The other thing, Scott Beck, who's from St. Johnsbury, drafted a letter to the money committees, the appropriations committee, to recommend that we do the governor's request, that is the funding the rail trail. I think we've all, if you haven't gone on the rail trail yet, you should get on it. It's very nice, easy to walk. Always lots of people on there. People have their dogs on there a lot too. It's a great time. And so that's could be a great economic driver. Stops along the rail trail. Hyde Park has done a great job with fixing up their little spot that runs by the town. Morrisville has their, by the park there, the Oxbow field. So, the rail trail's been a great asset, even though it's not even finished. So if we imagine what it would be like when it's finished, I think it would be a great boost, just from people moving along east to west. And let's see. Other than that, I think that just about covers it for me. Again, my time has been mostly taken up with Act 250 reform, and that even though that's technically out of my committee now, the story's not over yet, and it's got to go to the Senate. We'll see what the Senate does with it. And just quickly, I suppose, what we did in the bill was we did some environmental stuff around forest plots, and as a compromise, exempted designated downtowns and new development areas for development that would exempt themselves from Act 250. So that could be really important for our local downtowns to get their buildings up to snuff and modernized with efficiency and actual internet connection, good internet connection. So I think that'll be exciting. Hopefully that stays in the most important part of my mind is the exemption to downtowns and new development areas. I think that's going to be a real big boost for struggling downtown.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lucy Rogers. I represent Cambridge and Waterville, and I am on the House Healthcare Committee. So I'll be brief. I just wanted to mention a couple pieces that my committee has been working on in the last month. Last year, I was really involved in the committee in creating a Rural Health Services Task Force, which I think I spoke about at a number of these breakfasts. And one aspect of that was important to me was to have the task force be limited in time and scope such that they could come back to us with recommendations for this coming session and not have the recommendations be coming back to the same committee that created them with a clear commitment to follow through, which has happened, which has been really wonderful. So our two biggest projects in our committee are working on workforce development and working on telehealth, which were actually the top two asks that came back to us from the Rural Health Services Task Force. So with the telehealth bill that we're working on, telehealth is kind of a broad umbrella term that encompasses pretty much any way that a provider and a patient or a provider and a provider are interacting with each other when they're not in the same room. So it can be as specific as telemedicine, which is actually having your appointment with a physician or a different healthcare provider via a secure video connection, or it can be a little bit kind of less specific, such as your primary care provider sends a picture of a rash that you have to a specialist to ask the specialist whether you need to be referred to them. So there's a number of different methods of telehealth. The bill is mostly a bill about reimbursement, and so asking insurance companies to deciding which types of telehealth insurance companies should reimburse for, so that then providers will be incentivized to invest in these methods. I think there's a lot of opportunities with telehealth pertaining particularly to access to care, to people who struggle to access care in person, as well as actually freeing up. Sometimes, I don't know if anyone here has had the experience where you're referred to a specialist and you can't get in for over a year, and so by the time you get in, it's not even relevant anymore, or it's not a time that works. And so potentially it could free up appointment times if people who don't actually need to be referred to the specialist can be kind of vetted beforehand. So that's the opportunities. The one concern I have that I've been trying to voice and bring into the committee is to make sure that it's one of those things where you don't want to fix one problem and create another problem, and we know that particularly with the older population in Vermont, there's huge issues with social isolation and associated mental health issues, and so to make sure that we're using telehealth in an intentional way where it's not further isolating people and preventing them from having their healthcare appointments being an opportunity for face-to-face time. So those are kind of the two sides of that bill that we're working on. And then the other piece that came out of the Rural Health Services Task Force is workforce development. So we learned that, just to put the numbers into perspective, we are currently short 70 primary care physicians in Vermont. And we also have one of the oldest populations of primary care physicians, so physicians expected to retire within the next 10 years. And then we've heard the number, it's a little different depending on who you ask, but just that's kind of order of magnitude, that we're down 4,000 nurses in Vermont, which includes all the different levels of the different qualifications of nurses. So it's a pretty big concern for people's health care. We've been working on looking at different ways of addressing that, including a lot of the testimony we've heard has been around loan repayment and how scary it is for someone out of school to go to a rural place and practice if they're, in the case of a primary care physician, $400,000 in debt. So we've been looking at that, and then the one final piece pertaining to that is actually EMS workforce is another workforce concern, and so we're working on a bill that hopefully will get out this week that would put some money into training for EMS personnel. So oftentimes people are willing to volunteer, but they'll have to pay $1,000 in order to have the privilege of volunteering for their training, and even someone who's willing and wants to support their community, that's often just not viable. So that is, and what my committee's working on, I think we've mentioned in the past, but Senator Westman is on the kind of complementary committee in the Senate that will, so soon we'll be crossing bills over and switching tasks a little bit there.
Well, I'm Representative Mark Higley from Lowell. I represent Lowell, Jay, Westfield, Troy, and Eden, which is my Lamoille County town. I sit on energy and technology with Avram and Heidi. So I've been down there now for 12 years, and we spent the past 6 weeks, I'd say, pretty much on the Global Warming Solutions Act. I would say my 12 years is probably the worst piece of legislation I've ever seen. It heads us down a road where we don't really know what the cost is going to be and what the benefits are going to be. The one good thing is we were able to get an amendment passed that once this plan is created by the Climate Commission, that plan will be looked at by the Joint Fiscal Office or an outside firm that will come up with a cost-benefit and cost-benefit analysis, which I think is critical. Some other information that came to light and wasn't really even brought up in our committee was there was 2 spreadsheets that were out there. One, I believe, was from the administration that was looking at nearly $244 million a year that's being spent on current climate change initiatives. I went to the Joint Fiscal Office and asked them to look at this spreadsheet. They said they were working on one of their own and they had never finished it. It takes a lot of time to do these things. They did basically come up with a cost sheet last year that addressed from the 2018 budget anywhere from $168 million to $172 million in the preceding years. So that to me is critical in the sense of a lot of folks that came into the committee said that we aren't doing anything or aren't doing enough. Another big concern of mine again is, just to go back a little bit, that spreadsheet really doesn't cover anything that you folks may do in regards to putting solar on your house or any other initiatives that you may do, heat pumps in your house, not your cost. It also doesn't include towns' costs that are footing the bill for some infrastructure. I know I gave examples up in my area of Lowell during the Halloween flood. One major bridge went out. Don't know the actual cost of that, but we're going to be on the hook for at least 10% of that. We'd also voted at town meeting last year to put in an additional $300,000 for another bridge in town. That's at the town's expense. Eden lost a bridge and a large culvert. My concern is, again, and it's not just local, it's cities as well. You may have heard about a lot of sewage treatment plants and stuff that are going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars throughout the state, or old water lines, you name it, in cities. So again, I think with the ongoing expense of that, and then to have this expense of looking at carbon emissions reductions by who knows what efforts. I mean, we don't know yet. The number 1 carbon emitting is transportation. The number 2 is home and industrial heating. So again, those are the ones I think that are going to have to be whacked, but we don't know how that's going to be yet. So again, and I spoke to this on the floor, thought about it. There's a citizen's right to sue provision around not meeting these carbon reduction goals. But on the other end of things, we're referring to it as resilience and adaptation. That's where the towns have to adapt to the current climate change conditions. That's happening now. We understand that. And where is the citizen's right to sue for that provision? I asked, as a Conservation Law Foundation, which is the one that sued Massachusetts over their Global Warming Solutions Act, are they going to support towns in a suit against the state to come up with the money for infrastructure? And it's critical. In an example I gave, a bridge that did go out, when it went out, there was a fire on the other side of the bridge that would have taken the fire department 3 miles to get there. Because that bridge was out, they had to go 12 or 15. I mean, those sort of things are huge. So I just don't believe that, again, with the way it was set up and not knowing, if I don't know what the costs are going to be and I don't know how it's going to affect my constituents, that's definitely not something I'm going to vote for. So the other thing, last Friday afternoon, I went down and sat for an hour and a half and listened to Dr. Ken Finn. He's a doctor from Colorado Springs. Talk about the marijuana tax and regulate, actually not just in Colorado, but throughout the country. And in short, the hour and a half was pretty lengthy with very concerning statistics throughout these states that have tax and regulated marijuana. So again, that's something that I'll be fighting against, in my opinion.
All right. So, in the Senate, unlike the House, we're on 2 committees. My morning committee is Health and Welfare. Just to give you an idea, the Human Services Committee and the Healthcare Committee that Lucy sits on and Dan sits on, Human Services, we have the same responsibility and we do it in half a day. So it kind of gives you that picture. And my afternoon committee is appropriations. the biggest bill that we've been working on in Human Services, or the Health and Welfare Committee in the Senate, has been an elimination of flavored tobacco and with vaping products. And but the most controversial part of that is the elimination of menthol cigarettes. And I would just want to give you the picture in the whole of this. Very much, all 5 members of my committee are for getting rid of, in vaping products, flavored products, because they're directly right at kids. But as you eliminate that, we somewhat have become dependent upon the taxes around that we have put on tobacco. So the controversial piece in our committee is eliminating menthol cigarettes. Menthol cigarettes, the estimate from the Joint Fiscal Office is that it would cost, that the taxes from menthol cigarettes is about $3.8 million that comes in. All of our cessation program, tobacco cessation programs, the whole budget for the health department is $4.8 million. And a huge chunk of that is federal money. So as in a very tight budget year, as you talk about the reduction of that revenue, it puts at risk all of the cessation programs that we have in the health department. So it all depends on where you push the balloon. So our committee, the main focus has been, how do we get tobacco products away from youth? And youth has been the focus. So that's where menthol cigarettes comes in as a big fight. The bill would say it's not illegal for you to possess them, you just can't buy the menthol cigarettes here. So the split view in the committee is that if they can possess them, they're going to get them. And you're probably an older adult. It's really, and I'm going to say personally, it's really hard for me to tell some 75 or 80-year-old person that is addicted to cigarettes that, you know, you can't buy them here, but you can get them someplace else, and then we lose the revenue, and then we can't do any of the cessation programs. It's a really tough issue, and I know that the majority caucus, the Democratic caucus, is split right down the middle in the Senate, arguing about where to go and do them. I would just say to you, our Medicaid match is around 55-45, 55% federal, 45% state dollars. So if you take away the 3.8, we lose the match from the feds for healthcare programs, basically, because that's where all of the tobacco. That's just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the morning issue that we've been grappling with. The other piece health and welfare is dealing with, and I'll elaborate a little on what Lucy said about the workforce shortage amongst rural healthcare providers. Just to give you an idea, we're short 70 primary care doctors. That's figuring at an average of 1,500 patients per doctor. So if you have 1,500 times 70, that's someplace between 100 and 110,000 Vermonters right now. 1 out of every 6 people doesn't have a primary care doctor in the state. And the university is only graduating 6 primary care doctors a year. So the idea of catching up and where we're going to go is quite difficult as you look at that. We've been looking at a number of different bills, one about licensing nurse practitioners and expanding their scope of practice in our committee, in the Health and Welfare Committee, to help somewhat with that. On the nurses' side, when Lucy says we have a shortage of 4,000, I think their report said 3,900, but who's looking at details? A huge piece of that is because a huge piece of our nurses are in their 60s, and they're beginning to retire. So we have this slug of nurses coming through in there. 3,500 of those are out of the workforce right now, so the vacancy rate within hospitals, within home health agencies, within nursing homes is huge. But what that doesn't tell you is we have now 5,500 traveling nurses in the state. So 5,500 people that are coming for 13 weeks at a time at Copley, at Lamoille Home Health, at the nursing home, all across this state. The estimates are that those traveling nurses, because they roughly get paid double what a nurse here is, are costing us $70 million a year. If I had $70 million in this budget, I wouldn't be talking about vaping products or anything like that. I'd feel like I was in Fat City in the budget. But we don't, and so it's a huge issue. We are really in the overall short 9,000 nurses to be for a place where we could have that. And that's out of 25,000 nurses. So we're desperate to try to move the needle to see if we can get rid of the constriction about people going into nursing. We're only graduating 260 nurses a year in the programs in the state. So if we can't create more placements on the front side to get people into this, we're desperate for, and the desperation is mostly in rural communities. It's less in the larger hospitals. My afternoon committee's appropriations, we're the tailpipe at the end of the legislature because all money bills start in the House. We're the last place at any money bill. We're going to end up this week with the flavored tobacco bill. We end up with everything. But basically what we're doing there is just taking testimony from each of the departments right now before we get the budget from the House to do that. So that's probably enough right now.
Okay, we're going to go over the questions. I want to do a couple things. First of all, let's thank our legislators because we couldn't lose a couple before the question period's over. The other thing I want to say is that every one of these legislators, they represent us. They are reachable and they are responsive. So if you want to speak to them individually, we can give you all kinds of contact information. So they're more than willing to be reached. Let me turn it over to questions. All right. Keep the questions short, and the person who's most familiar will respond. Yes.
Relative to the global warming solution, one of the things I've noticed in reading so often in the newspaper when an issue comes up and we're discussing what solutions are, inevitably they will say, but because of legislation, we can't do this, or we can't do that, or we have to pay this. And everybody just seems to accept that, oh, you know, there's this bad legislation or whatever out there that causes us to do this, so we just end up having to do it all the time, even though it doesn't always make sense. As applied to the global solutions, I am concerned about the issue that Heidi raised, that we are going to hand over an awful lot of responsibility to a group of bureaucrats who are going to then be able to determine a whole lot about our future. One of the things that always strikes me about so many of the global warming initiatives I hear is they're always seem to be big on regulation and very light on solutions. I've talked with, when I speak with my friends about the issue, and we're usually coming at it from two different sides, I always say, what are the specific solutions that you're in favor of? I mean, I know you're in favor of marching in Washington, I know you're in favor of doing this, but let's talk about what we really can do to solve the problem. I seem to recall a few years ago, somebody put together a map saying if we're going to become carbon neutral on the schedule that we've talked about, we'd have to build this many wind generators, this much solar capacity, and here's what a map would look like if we had all that infrastructure built out. And there would be wind generators on water ridge lines, there'd be solar farms everywhere we look. I've heard very little about that, and when we talk about legislation like this, there doesn't seem to be any roadmap to say, there's a roadmap to say we have to reach these goals, but there doesn't seem to be any roadmap to say, here's how we're gonna get there, here are the things we're gonna do to get there. So anyway, I think three of you have spoken about that issue, and I guess I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Start with Avram.
First of all, in terms of the last comment you made, the problem is that there is no roadmap, and if you read the bill that was passed, the purpose of the bill is to finally, in a very aggressive timetable, come up with a roadmap. It does not in itself, it asks for recommendations and rules to actually implement things. Secondly, in terms of the kinds of carbon reduction things that I think are contemplated at this time, when it comes to electric generation in Vermont and in New England, we have actually significantly reduced the carbon emissions from electric generation in Vermont, and that is by far not the largest source of carbon emissions here. By far the largest source is transportation. Next is thermal, is heating. And I think the focus at this point, yes, we can do more in terms of renewable energy, but the big focus will be on the kinds of, I'm going to say, dispersed emissions that happen everywhere, not coming from large single sources, because that's not the biggest problem, at least in this part of the country.
If I can add, so yeah, I agree with Avram that the climate action plan that this council comes up with will be sort of the roadmap, basically, and it will deal with really going after transportation and thermal. But I will say again, we did make clear, it was made clear to us that they cannot promulgate rules to increase taxes or fees, but everything else is on the table with regard to promulgating rules by the Secretary of A&R. And yes, indeed, there is some extremely limited, in my view, legislative involvement, and that is through LCAR, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. I've been in the legislature for 14 years. LCAR is way out of my league. And if it's out of my league, it's out of your league. It is just not something that it is not a substitute for legislative action. And we are the people closest to the people, closest to you. We are elected, we are accountable. You can kick us out in 2 years if we do the wrong thing. We should be the ones, for significant policy decisions, should be the ones making those decisions. And that is my concern. Again, I think putting the goals as requirements is fine. I actually am fine with the cause of action as well. The things are good. The Climate Action Committee, or the council, I think will be problematic. It's a very tight timeline, and there's 22 people on it. And it's going to be extremely, so there's some work to do on that too. But the ultimate for me is that, again, it is, I fought against, and I know there's a large majority of the House voted for this. Frankly, a large majority of the House voted for Act 46 as well in 2014. And this was my argument in 2014 I made on the House floor. I said, you are giving a significant amount of legislative responsibility to a state board of education, unelected, unaccountable people. And what is the result? Stowe School District no longer exists, Elmore Morristown School District no longer exists, and countless others throughout the state because of 5 unelected people, unaccountable people. And that is a problem. And yes, that's different, that didn't go through rules, but LCAR has no veto authority. They have no, they can actually say they have concerns about rules, and the rules can still go into effect. LCAR is no substitute for legislative action and legislative authority and legislative responsibility. So that is a real concern, and again, to those people who say, oh, other people don't have those concerns and it passed by a large majority, so did Act 46, and I fought against that, and I don't regret fighting against that. I think I was right, and I think a lot of us who voted against it were right.
Thanks. Matt?
Going back to the energy discussion, I apologize, I do have to leave after meet somebody at work. But the way I think about how we deal with energy issues, I think we should begin, and we used to do it better, is incentivize individuals to be energy independent themselves. I believe before my time, there was an incentive, a state incentive for solar panels, for example, and then combine that with a federal one, it's kind of a no-brainer, I think. The last time I looked into it for my house, there wasn't really a win there. It was, it's about the same. It's not, I'm not that motivated to do, there's not, hopefully, there is some cost to it. Anyway, the point is, if we incentivize individuals to be energy independent, I think that's the better way to go, rather than having solar fields or wind turbines or whatever. And there are some incentive things too, like there's the wood stove, upgrade your old wood stove to a more efficient one. There's things like that. But I think we'd be best served to incentivize solar panels for individual properties, individual homes.
Next question, yeah.
And I gotta run, I'm sorry.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the global warming solution conversation. I agree with Heidi that this is definitely something that we need to do. The general ideas of the bill are good, but I too am really, really concerned with handing over legislative power to the executive. And she brought up the Act 46 in the past and how all of this stuff has already unfolded in another realm. It's also unfolded in the healthcare realm. It's unfolded in pre-K over the last few years, where the legislature passed a bill, didn't have really any specifics in the bill, and it took years for the rules to be passed down to the local communities on how this was all going to play out. And going back to the Act 46 discussion, the chair of the committee who wrote the bill, he has since come, just recently out and said that the committee were hoodwinked during the legislative process, and that I don't know who hoodwinked them, but who, someone tricked them about what the results of the bill were going to be. Someone tricked them into thinking that the legislative intent of the bill would actually matter at the end of the day. And as we've seen here, as we've seen in other communities around the state, that didn't happen. So I guess the question is, for those of you who voted for the bill, you have confidence that you aren't being hoodwinked, and you have confidence that you won't be back here in a few years explaining to us why this decision was wrong.
Oh, Mark, let's go.
Yeah, I can, talk about that. There was quite an extensive list of folks that testified over the 6 weeks. And to me, it was pretty much all environmental groups or, scholars that had teachings around climate change and so on. And to me, the general process in a bill is, the example that I gave was, let's say, licensing of foresters. So 50% of the foresters didn't want to be licensed, 50% did. You have them in, they testify, each group or whatever, the pros and cons, and then a decision is made by the legislature and that committee to determine whether or not to go forward. In this case, there's really nothing there other than setting up this commission that you can argue about or talk about, because you don't know what's in it yet. And again, I go back to the rules provision in it. How many of you folks, and I know I'm speaking for my constituents now, I would dare say, don't even know about a particular rule that's being addressed, promulgated down there. And, you know, back in the paper, a little notice that says on such and such a date, you know, at 7 o'clock, go down to wherever. First of all, they're not aware of that. And second of all, a lot of the comments that I hear from people is, well, my opinion isn't gonna matter anyway. And that's on a scale of where I bring it back to, you know, that's where I come in. That's how I represent my constituents. And if I can't have that upfront say, again, another example of all this, to me, is you should look at Massachusetts. They've had a Global Warming Solutions Act for a number of years now, trying to meet these goals. Like I said, the Conservation Law Foundation sued them. They lost in the lower courts, won in the Supreme Court. But you can look at some of the things they've done down there, which are pretty extreme. They've banned all biomass plants creating electricity. So we have the McNeil plant, we have the Rygate plant. That's critical for our forest industry to keep those things going as well. And plus, you know, we had the mayor in the other day, and he was all praises for his McNeil plant. So, you know, they need that. It's part of their, you know, carbon footprint, saying that they have a zero carbon footprint when it comes to that. The state of Massachusetts was looking for, I think, 300,000 new electric vehicles by 2025. As of 2018, they had 15,000. You know, and I asked the individual from Massachusetts, you know, well, we aren't going to meet that goal. Well, what are some of the things you're looking at? And one of the things was they were looking at maybe Uber and Lyft drivers and other things like that, raising the registration fees and taxes on them so high that more people will take the subway and mass transit in the city here. I mean, so these are the sort of things that I don't know what's coming down the pike. And again, my constituents don't know either. And are these some of the drastic things that are going to happen? They wanted, I thought it was 800 and some megawatts of offshore wind. When we had Massachusetts in, they said they're actually looking for 3,200 megawatts of offshore wind. Now Lowell's wind project is just 62 megawatts. So think about that. You know, they've been trying to get power from Hydro-Quebec through Vermont. That didn't work out. Trying to get it through the pass, the northern pass in New Hampshire. That didn't work out. Now they're trying in Massachusetts. So, you know, it's all good to you know, again, put these strict benchmarks. They aren't goals. They're benchmarks. And if you don't meet them, then somebody's going to sue. And I guarantee you somebody's going to sue. And again, I go back to, there was an individual from Lake Champlain Regional Planning who said, maybe we shouldn't be so critical about the benchmarks for the first 5 years, but again, deal with the adaptation and resiliency, because it's happening now. So anyway.
Okay. If you want to stay on this subject, fine. I want to offer an opportunity to change subjects because we'll run out of time. Yes, you have a different subject?
Yes. Dan, I think this one would be directed toward you, because I heard you talking about for the health services of the board that you're on for Dale, that I hear there's some good things coming that you're advocating for children and for elderly. But I happen to be a service coordinator for those with developmental disabilities. And don't know if you guys are doing anything to try to fight in that area, because we have also been level funded for a long time. I know a while ago we were quoted as the golden parachute, if you want to say, for services, that we had more money coming in and we knew what to do with it, which is not true. We have had a clinical coordinator position open vacant for a while, which is basically a therapist who has a specialty for those with developmental disabilities. Because you'd be amazed how hard it is to find someone with an expertise in that area. And the big fact is the last two that we had finally left because they just couldn't afford to stay in the position, because we can't afford to pay them what they can do either working for a state position or even working for their own private practice. And another area is that we have such a high rate of turnover from our, our support staff workers up through service coordinators for the same reason. We can't afford to pay them or offer them the pay of a living position, you know, for them to be able to work with those with disabilities who come with some pretty big issues at times. So they're getting paid, you know, a very low level compared to what you could get paid at even, you know, working at Price Chopper or working at McDonald's, you know. But we don't have the money coming in to be able to pay them, so I don't know if there's anything in the works on that front.
So two things, Teresa Wood is very much an advocate. I don't know if you know her from Waterbury,
Yes,
she was
do,
the
yeah.
deputy commissioner for a while, and so she has been a great advocate for the DD services, and in our budget letter, there was a cut to attendant services, and so we put that money should be restored. And then also in the Older Vermonters Act, the increase to home and community-based providers it's a inflationary increase every year, because right now, unlike nursing homes where there's a inflationary each year or a methodology to have that happen, it would apply to those services as well. So those are two things that are coming out of our committee, right, hopefully. Teresa and I have been advocating for that, to make sure that those services are adequately funded and not just keep being level funded for years like they have been.
Thank you, Jan.
Dan,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question about our older Vermonters. As you know, we have a shortage of housing, period, in Vermont, but we're starting to see more and more homeless folks with absolutely no money, living in a car, living in shelters. The shelter's going to close in April, and you had said you were in a planning stage for older Vermonters, and I just wondering what those plans included.
So the bill is the Older Vermonters Act. We do talk about some housing in there. There's also some changes in Act 250 that may address some access to affordable housing in village centers, actually downtowns and neighborhoods. I would like to have seen them include village centers because we have a lot more of those in our rural communities. And it's just a matter of having access to, you know, affordable housing like Lamoille Housing Partnership is trying to build around here. It's really hard to stay in some of our older housing stock that's out further out. How do you heat it? How do you maintain it? And so also transportation becomes an issue. We've actually have some really good at dropping people off. It's picking them up, and that part of fixed route transportation can be a problem. So
It's a big problem here in
yeah.
Vermont.
And absolutely. So, you know, trying to figure out how we reduce barriers to affordable housing is going to be some of the topics we'll be working on. Go ahead.
Hey, Lucy, I noticed in the paper there a couple of weeks ago, you said that you went back and I guess they passed some bills and you went back to make sure that everything was working. I commend you for doing that. And I think all you folks should do that, because every year we go down there and pass a whole bunch of more bills and we don't even know if what we passed is working. So I think that's a great thing to think about, because in my business, at the end of the year, we always go back and say, what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what's working, what isn't working, and we make changes there. So I think that was a great thing you did.
Thanks, yeah, I think, thank you, Greg. Just to add to that, I think it's one thing that I feel like I've kind of been stepping into this year that's different from last year, where I was just getting my feet under me and really focused on the legislation. And I think everyone here does a pretty good job at this, is thinking about what I think as legislators, we often can get sucked into thinking that every problem has a solution that has to do with policy. And I think just really thinking about our technical role is to write legislation, but we're also in leadership positions in our community, which means that we have other abilities such as calling up the Department of Financial Regulation, which in this case of the article is the regulatory oversight for the laws that were passed, and saying, this is what I've been hearing, why is this not being enforced? And that's something that is something that we can do as legislators that isn't necessarily a policy solution to a problem, but still is a solution to a problem. And so I think I've been this year really trying to think about the goal is to solve the problems and what do we need to do that, rather than trying to force everything into a policy solution, which I think everyone here is pretty focused on that.
Okay, we're at the end of our official time, and so everyone's free to move on if they need to, and if you want to capture a legislator, do your best. They're here for now. Thank you very, very much, and thank you to Mike Hartman for providing this space. Lamoille County Mental Health.